no interest, stay there. You can come closer a bit. So welcome to everyone. So to the tonight urban and environmental theory session. The main part of the audience is, in fact, students that are following the MIS in territorial project, but I think that there are some other people connected on Zoom, so also welcome to you that you are on Zoom. I'm really happy tonight to welcome Philippe Vandenbroeck. Unhappily, is not here in person because of a cold that has obliged him to stay at home. So we hadn't no other choice to out of doing like this, but we are happy. And you know, Philippe, I told you, really, really students here are very excited to meet you. And you had a small talk before with Philippe, and I explained him that in the frame of the MIS, there is a class that I'm leading with Anna Pagani on system thinking and territorial design in the age of transition, where we try to give an answer to a question that we have raised, that the question is really what about the relation between system thinking and the territorial design today in light of challenges of transition and in light of the very speed change and acceleration in some material, cultural, social processes. We know that since the limits to growth, there's no future out of a systemic approach of any kind of processes. And this is the reason why we have a more architectural culture, urban designer culture. We think that we had find a way to deal and to take benefit of this very varied universe that is system thinking. And yes, we are speaking before about the fact that I proposed you a metaphor to represent what system thinking is. The metaphor is system thinking is a forest where we have to find to sketch to sketch paths, sketch segment of trajectory that can be relevant for us, that can be answer to urgency that we are confronted with. Sorry, and we really ask you in a way tonight to help us to find some relevant and yes, right and pertinent tracks inside this forest. I do not want to add any more to this presentation because I asked Anna to introduce you, Philippe, really you as person, your personal trajectory, because Anna knows you better than I do. So I think it's better if Anna, I let you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elena, and thank you very, very much, Philippe, for being here. Like virtually, but here nowadays, it's fantastic. It looks like if you were with us right now, because as if you were sitting in front of us. So I had a big pleasure to meet Philippe in June during a PhD summer school on regenerative design, where he gave talks that were extremely inspiring for me. And that is why I think that also the talk of tonight is going to be inspiring for you. And so I summarize his bio quickly, although you'll see it's pretty impressive, because he was trained as bioengineer, but also as philosopher and urban planner. And he works as action researcher and facilitator as shiftN, which is a consultancy that is dedicated to supporting organizational learning processes in context of transition. But in addition, he is also pursuing a PhD research, and in particular at the chair of architecture and urban transformation at ETH in Zürich, on enthusiasm for silent urban transformation. And he's also in parallel the director of a new nonprofit called S.E.R.D, which is inspired by the life and work of Michel Serres. And not only all this long video, but also big passions, which are photography and creative writing, which overall contribute to the post-disciplinary brand of research that he pursues. But I don't want to talk any longer, and I want to leave you the floor now, Philippe. Very curious to hear you.
Thank you very much, Anna and Elena, Valentin also, for the invitation. And indeed, very unfortunate. I was really stoked to travel to Lausanne and join you all there physically, but there's a kind of a slumbering cold which has been plaguing me for the last couple of days, and we all decided that it was probably the wisest not to travel. And I hope to see you again at a later occasion. Actually, I'm planning to be on campus if it's all useful and timely later this year, in December perhaps. And so hopefully that is an opportunity then to continue the conversation. I will, I'm happy to take up that invitation to talk about systems thinking and perhaps trace a path through the forest, the thicket that Elena conjured before our mental eye. And in fact, I'm going to share my screen so that you can follow my train of thought. Is that showing up appropriately? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, super. I'm actually, I've labeled or titled my presentation as a dérive. So that is in a way a kind of a spontaneous, intuitive seeking of a path in an urban environment or elsewhere. It could also be in a forest. And so why did I choose to position the talk as such? It's a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction, I would say, because we must acknowledge that over the past years, there has been a little bit of a hype around systems thinking. And I'm a bit wary of fueling that hype. And to the contrary, I would like actually to dampen or mitigate people's expectations about what systems thinking can offer. It's definitely not a magic wand, but it is merely, I would say, a style of thinking and acting that in certain circumstances may be helpful. And I'm going to take you through a small exhibition with a number of exhibits, a very limited number of exhibits, which are going to help me to tell a story about how I am, looking at and practicing, so to speak, systems thinking. And my first exhibit is a plate of spaghetti, which is more or less inevitable as an image almost, because when you would Google for systems thinking and you would look at the visuals and the visualizations that are associated with that, you inevitably end up with these very complex systems maps, which look like a kind of a plate of spaghetti. And it's almost like this is the official language of systems thinking. And I think it's part of the whole field and the whole discipline, but it's only a small part. And what I would like to do in my talk is actually to reframe systems thinking away from this very dominant way of looking at systems thinking. And the image that I'm showing here is, I think, is a good visual metaphor for the way we tend to approach systems thinking, which is as almost not a magic wand, but a magic fork that allows us to unravel the complexity with which we are faced, in our, whether it's daily lives or strategic ambitions or transition ambitions. And so the idea or the expectation is that yeah, in some way it helps us to magically unravel that. So what I would like to do is to reframe the whole systems field away from a dominant approach, which particularly frames systems thinking as an analysis or an approach to an analysis that focuses particularly on the way in which we can understand systems as consisting of subsystems or parts that are interacting with one another, and that through that interaction are determining the system's behavior. So it's definitely part of the picture again, but it's a little bit, from my point of view, a little bit of a reductionist interpretation of what systems thinking, and I have also a problem with that notion and that label, and I will try to expand on that a little bit later. But I want to reframe it a little bit away from that dominant perspective. And maybe a quote which already, let's say, looks ahead at the kind of terrain that I would like to cover in my presentation. It's a quote from a book by an American philosopher, Jose Medina. The book is titled The Epistemology of Resistance, and he talks about imagination. And it goes as follows. Imagination is crucial because it engages will and is therefore closer to action than reason. In addition, imagination is positional. It concerns our relation in the world and to others. Imagination enables us to see the meaningfulness of others' lives. In this sense, imaginative pragmatism, as he calls it, is the habit of always seeing an alternative, of seeing things in perspective. And that is kind of the tenor or the tone that I would like to give or impart my presentation with. Because indeed, I think that systems thinking is more something to step into than to master. It is more a matter of imagination than it is of mere technical competence or analysis. And that is what I would like to develop in the next half hour or so. So my perspective on what this quote does for me is actually it offers, on the one hand, a critical perspective, critical in the sense that it makes us aware of the limitations of our own individual perspectives. That's the positionality that Medina talks about. And it's generative. It's generative in the sense that it is focused on creating new possibilities. And I think that is, from my point of view, very much embedded in the core ethos of a systems approach. So I'm going to transition to my second exhibit, which is a portrait, a picture of one of the important people in the post-war, let's say, tradition or field of systems science, so to speak, systems ideas, Gregory Bateson, British, but then worked most of his life in the United States. And I like the thinking of Bateson a lot for several reasons. One reason is that he actually didn't manage, or maybe probably didn't want to develop one grand narrative about systems thinking. His work, his oeuvre is very fragmentary. He has a series of books which belong to very different disciplines. He started out as an anthropologist and then moved into psychology, later on into zoology and artificial intelligence, and you name it. So it's very fragmented in that sense from a disciplinary point of view, but also his most known book in the ecology of mind is actually a collection of essays. It's not a kind of a unified theory. His magnum opus, Mind and Nature, is actually two books clumsily woven into one another. And then there's a series of books which have been posthumously published based on archive material and conversations with his daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson. So I like actually that fragmentary nature of his work, because it already alerts us to the fact that perhaps there is no grand theory of systems thinking, but there's always limited and fragmentary perspectives. I also like Bateson's work because he actually articulated, from my point of view, what is the critical question, or the crucial question that underlies our interest and the impulse to engage in this field. And he phrased it as follows: what is the pattern which connects all living creatures? It's arguably, it's a very big question, but still, I think it's good to keep that in mind, even if a priori, it's very hard to formulate an answer to that. But what the clue that he gives us is that he says the pattern is actually a meta pattern. It is a pattern of patterns, and it is a dynamic pattern. It is actually what he calls mental process. It is actually what living systems, i.e. open systems, do in order to maintain, to come into being. Hence his interest in embryology, for instance, to come into being, to come to life, but also to maintain what I call viability. Viability is a term that I'm borrowing from one subfield in the systems thinking, which is cybernetics. And this has to do with how entities, whatever their nature, adjust and survive, maintain their integrity, maintain their viability in an environment. So that leads me to my third exhibit, which is a picture of an archipelago. But for the time being, I would like to zoom in on simply one of those islands in that constellation. And so an island in an ocean is almost like an archetypal visual metaphor for this basic notion of a system. There is something which is embedded in an environment. So we have basically three things to start with. One is a boundary between an outside and an inside. And that's basically where we take our starting point from. So this is a very basic, let's say, given, and a very basic, I would say, definition almost of a system, but it already offers us a lot of opportunities, because the boundary can be physical or it can be notional, it can be a conceptual boundary. And we are actually at liberty in many cases to determine where that boundary lies. So that gives us a lot of flexibility, so to speak, in defining systems, studying them, and interacting with them. So, this island in an ocean, it could be an individual in its environment, it could be an organization in its social environment, it could be a city embedded in its hinterland. There's many ways of, let's say, kind of transposing this basic idea of an entity embedded in an environment to all kinds of domains of human life, so to speak, and so that's one thing. Now let's superimpose a time dimension on this picture, and actually then I ought to show you a video where the time starts to elapse, and then we have possibly a change in that environment. So we have the entity, the system, embedded in its environment. Now, suppose we have an evolving time, then it's likely that that environment will not be static. It's going to evolve, it's going to change. And that's where, from my point of view, this crucial question then comes, and which is, how is that system going to maintain its viability in that changing environment? That is, from my point of view, is a crucial question within the whole systems field. It's about maintaining viability. In systems parlance, we also say there is a structural coupling between the system and its environment, and we're going to try and find out how that system is able to maintain that structural coupling over time, even if that environment is going to change. Now, what is going to happen? A priori, we cannot say, we don't know actually, because it determines, or it depends on two things, basically. First is the amplitude of the changes in the environment. They can be small, they can be large. And the other thing is the ability of the system to adjust to those changes, i.e. its resilience. And one of the basic insights from system science is exactly that. It is called the law of requisite variety, or Ashby's law, and it expresses exactly that idea, that when you have an entity in an environment and that environment is going to change, i.e. shows a particular level of complexity or a certain level of variety, then that entity has to be able to absorb at least that level of complexity in order to survive, in order to maintain that viability. That is what is expressed by Ashby's law. And so it has to have a kind of a minimum level of resilience, because otherwise we know that sooner or later it's going to be confronted with a set of external conditions with which it cannot deal. And hence it could be fatal. It could be fatal to the system. And there the structural coupling between the system and the environment is then disrupted. And that is, by the way, one way of framing where we as humanity are currently dealing with in terms of climate change. The amplitude of the changes is increasing. And do we have enough resilience, i.e. are we able to adapt to those changing conditions? From my point of view, there's two things that are necessary in order to conceptualize resilience. I mean, it's one way of conceptualizing resilience, but I think it hinges on two things. One is access to resources. And those can be inside the system or outside of the system. And the second thing is the intelligence, so to speak, or the capacity to use those resources. Those are two different things. And Aaron Antonovsky, a medical sociologist, has labeled that intelligence the sense of coherence of that system, which allows it to use those resources in a kind of an appropriate way in order to deal with these external disturbances, and so to maintain that structural coupling. So that's the idea of viability, and I think that's quite a key idea. I'm actually transitioning to my next exhibit, which is in fact the same picture, but now we're zooming out from the individual island to the archipelago as a whole. And it allows me to articulate a number of different ideas. First of all, the question is, what are we then exactly looking at? Because when we look at an individual island, the picture is rather clear. It's very simple, structurally speaking. When we zoom out, it becomes more difficult because we have a constellation, and it's maybe not so easy to draw exactly the border around that constellation that we might label as or consider as a separate system. So this is where the element of boundary judgment comes into play, which is that we need to be aware that when we define a system, that this is actually a matter of judgment, and that we need to be mindful and reflexive about how we exactly define or put that boundary in place. And the second idea that I would like to associate to this picture of an archipelago is the point that was made earlier by Elena, which is the following. Let me first perhaps articulate or define, as I understand it, a number of systems-related concepts. We're talking about systems science and systems theory. For me, these are more or less, interchangeable, as a set of ideas about how we frame our relationship with the world and how we conceptualize that intelligence that maintains that structural coupling with our changing environment. That, for me, is what I would call systems science. Now, systems thinking, we might see as the application of these ideas to specific challenges to viability, considering, for instance, a specific system which we might start to think, problem solve around in terms of this ambition to maintain viability. That would perhaps be something like systems thinking. But the point is that we cannot do that, I think, at least in my opinion, as completely dissociated observers. We're always implicated in that system. So it becomes, by definition, the systems thinking becomes systems practice. So it's always a matter, not only of formulating ideas, but also of acting upon these ideas in the real world. And that's why I particularly like the way that Ray Eisen at the Open University in the UK positions this discipline or this field as systems thinking in practice, which brings those two, the thinking and the practice, together in an evolving reflexive practice. And I think that's an important idea, that we cannot dissociate the thinking and the practice. And so I have a couple of, let's say, musings or reflections around that. First of all, I think by now it should be clear that this notion of transition is completely central to systems ideas or systems theory. When we think systemically, so to speak, or consider or take a systemic perspective, from my point of view, the question is always about change. It's always about, so to speak, adaptation to changing conditions. And so there's a natural coupling between those two, let's say, the challenge of transition and the perspective of a systemic perspective. Then a second reflection I would like to connect to that, and now I'm coming to that point that Elena already revealed about the forest, that is that we may have, we may be able to phrase what the central question around, let's say from a systemic point of view is. The thing is that system science or the systems field does not offer a cohesive answer to those questions. There are actually different schools, almost different islands in an archipelago that differ sometimes really radically in their basic philosophical assumptions. So you have, let's say, a very engineering, objectivist, scientific approach to systems. And on the other hand of the spectrum, there is a very constructivist, performative perspective on systems. And this is actually the one, despite being an engineer, this is the one I feel most related to. And it's actually not so easy to establish a productive conversation between those different schools in this field. From my point of view, when we're talking about systems thinking, system science, practice, and so on, none of these terms are pre-given. From my point of view, it is not about truth, but it's actually about finding, and this is very maybe modest, but it's about finding clever and humane ways also to maintaining viability, to take up that challenge about maintaining viability as a society, potentially, if we decide that this is where our ambition and relevant questions are. So from my point of view, conceptualizing systems principles is in itself a manifestation of that intelligence that we are actually aiming to study. Remember that point about resilience, about having resources and about having the capacity and the intelligence to use those resources. Well, from my point of view, our entry, discovery, so to speak, or ingenuity in starting to think in systems terms contributes, from my point of view, to that intelligence. So on the one hand, we're thinking about the intelligence, and on the other hand, we're changing at the same time. And so for me, this is a reflection of, and now I'm going to use a couple of, let's say, big words, but it's a constructivist, it's a manifestation of a constructivist, a pragmatist, a critical, and an inactive worldview or epistemology. Very briefly, what do I mean by constructivist? It means that the function of our cognition is organization of our experiential world rather than the discovery of an independent reality. So it's not that we have privileged access to what is out there. No, we have sensory experience and we organize that. And that is what cognition is about. That's what is constructivism about. It's pragmatist and not pragmatic, pragmatist in the philosophical tradition of American pragmatism in this particular case, because mental process is an instrument for problem solving, which is very, very, well, pragmatic, yes. So it's not to describe or represent or mirror reality, but it is actually a very pragmatic deal of, finding our way through the mess with which we are constantly actually confronted. It's also critical, because the construction of meaning in which we are continuously involved inevitably takes shape through social interaction. And so and it also occurs in a particular social and historical institutional context. And it raises a lot of questions about power, of course, about who says what, who frames, who decides where is a system and where the boundary is, and so on. So I think that critical dimension is absolutely crucial. And it's inactive also. My brand of constructivism that I would honor is inactive because it's not only about the brain. We are biological organisms. We are actually, we are manifesting ourselves in a kind of a physical body, and that in itself is important in the way we, experience our surroundings. So the logic of bodies and of bodies interacting is a fundamental, let's say, tunes our perception and gives direction to the way we interface with the world, and therefore also the way we conceptualize and deal with systems, so to speak. So the main point I wanted to make in these last remarks is that when we think about the systems field and the systems practice, for me, there are three layers. There's a conceptual layer of ideas, for sure. And system dynamics, for instance, has its place in that. There is a performative layer of what I would call not systems thinking, but systems tinkering. Tinkering meaning, we're trying to find our way in a kind of a haphazard way through complexity. That's the performative element. And the third layer on top of that is a dispositional layer. Dispositional meaning that it's not only a matter of brain, it's not only a matter of action, it's also a matter of being. How we as systems practitioners are actually positioned in vis-a-vis, so to speak, the challenges that we are exposed to and where we're actually part of. So that is, I think, an important idea. And these conceptual, performative, and dispositional elements in the practice, we are unable to dissociate from one another. One informs the other. And I hope that by now you have an idea of my drift, and it sounds maybe very, very conceptual, but I at the same time it's also very simple, and it is part of our daily lives. And I want to illustrate that by my next exhibit, which is a box of watches. And this brings me back to a story that once I read it, stuck in my mind. I picked that story up in a book by Sara Sarasvati, who is a management scholar. She actually did her PhD with Herbert Simon, Nobel Prize Economics, and one of the luminaries in the systems, post-war systems thinking also. And what Sarasvati did was to study how entrepreneurs are actually creating something from nothing. She did empirical research on that. And there's a story in a book by her, which I found really intriguing. And it's a story about how one of the biggest business empires of the 20th century came to life. It's the Sears and Roebuck and Co. Maybe it's now almost totally forgotten. Actually, they're in the process now of bankruptcy. But it was actually the Amazon of the 20th century. And as architects, you will be familiar with the Sears Tower, which has now been rebaptized in the Willis Tower in Chicago, which has for a long time been the tallest building in the world. But the story starts with a really minute, trivial anecdote. And Mr. Sears, when he was in his 20s, was working as a station clerk in a little village on a railway line in the midst of the prairies in the United States. And he had as one of his tasks was to take delivery of shipments all over the world and to bring them almost as a mailman to the destination. And one of the shipments was a box of watches, which was destined to a jeweler. And the jeweler actually refused to accept that box because he didn't order it, he said. And so there was the question at that particular moment in time to Sears, what would he do with that? and actually decided to keep the box for himself. So he paid for it himself. And he started to sell those watches to his colleagues up and down the line. And that went so surprisingly well that he ordered another box, and he started to send them out also, you know, further afield. And there was a mail order business that was being born. And, you know, just a couple of years later, this turned into, you know, a real business empire. Now, what's you will say, you know, what has this to do with systems thinking? I think quite a lot, actually, because what we have there is a particular pattern of behavior which is led by curiosity, by a certain willingness to take risks and to explore. That's basically what this whole story about Sears stands for. And, you know, it created something larger than life, which Sears at no point in his early career would have been able to imagine. This is an example of transition from my point of view. But the thing is that the way Sarasvati articulates the pattern behind this kind of behavior, which she observed with many different entrepreneurs, is really intriguing and revealing, I find. Because what does Sarasvati say? She says, for these people, business plans are not important. It's not about what is on paper. It is actually a number of rules of thumb, very simple rules, which these people continue to apply again and again. And that leads to novelty. It leads to the liberation, so to speak, of potential. And that is basically what an entrepreneur does. What are these rules? First of all, these people start with what they have. So they do not seek out alternative resources. They start with what they have in their hands. Second, they have some idea of where they want to go to, but it's dim. It's not carved in stone. It's not a plan that is rigidly codified. It is some idea. And the third thing which they have in mind is an idea of what they want to lose when they take the next step. And that's important. So it's an idea of the kind of risk they want to run when they move into the unknown. And with those things in mind, they start to interact with the world outside of them. And through those interactions, they get to new commitments, alliances, partnerships with other people. And that gives them access to new resources. And on the other hand, it also learns something about their own ambitions. So these ambitions are likely to modify in that process. And actually what we have there is what I see as a prototypical image of a social learning cycle. And that is, again, from my point of view, a very central idea, from my point of view, in the systems thinking and practice, is that when we are dealing with transition, say, when we are dealing with complexity, as a collective, as a society or an organization, basically the only option we have is to be very smart in the way we design this process of collective learning or of collaborative learning. That is basically what I think that a systems practice comes down to. And this, this theory that Sarasvati proposes is a theory of entrepreneurship, but we find this archetype in many different fields of human activity. And for instance, if you're familiar with the work of Nicholas Nassim Taleb, with his anti-fragility, this is exactly the same story, but told with another language. It's about making small bets. It's about what he calls convex tinkering. And so moving ahead, taking, let's say, absorbable risks in order to have the chance at, let's say, a big, payout or a big bonus. And I think that's basically also how evolution and life, natural evolution is happening. So for me, this notion of social learning is very, very central in systems practice. And for me, transition basically is a matter of social learning. And then the question is, how do we do that? That's the core question. How do we do that as urbanists, landscaper, architects? That's a really interesting question to think about. Now, before I move there, or maybe as a transition, I'd like to show you another exhibit, which is the Cathedral of Chartres, which you will no doubt as architects be familiar with, which has been, well, at the time, end of the 13th century, it was a tremendous innovation. And the question is, how did that innovation, that breakthrough come about? Well, there's different, of course, there's different, I would say, perspectives on this. But the thing is, it's almost like a mystery, given that the plans for this building have never been found back. We don't even know the names of the architects. We also know that at that point, when this was built, people had no knowledge of structural mechanics. So they couldn't calculate how this thing is actually designed to remain upright. There was not even in France at that point in time a shared measurement unit. You know, it was all over the place, depending upon where you were. You know, length was expressed in different ways. So you could ask yourself, how on earth were they able to build such a thing? Like, and it's difficult to explain in a way. One way, of course, is the blueprint hypothesis. There was a plan. We didn't find it, but there must have been a plan. It's otherwise inconceivable that something like this would have emerged. And there's the non-blueprint hypothesis, which I think is the more convincing one. The non-blueprint hypothesis, which I'm getting from Tim Ingold, who gets it from David Turnbull in his really marvelous book, Masons, Tricksters, and Cartographers. He tells a story about Chartres as a laboratory for full-scale experiments in new building techniques, or well, received building techniques also, because there was a lot of craft involved, of course. And so fascinating to see how the structure of the cathedrals, according to Turnbull, resulted from a multiplicity of factors combining with one another, which produced a particular form. So the Gothic style as such was not in the minds of the builders. It was an emergent property. And I think this is something that, you know, I think is a really interesting kind of example to keep in mind, because I think it is true for many of the breakthroughs and many of the transitions, so to speak, that we are involved in, is that we cannot foresee the final shape. It is a matter of almost patiently experimenting or running parallel experiments, keeping design options open as long as you can, whilst dealing step by step with the complexity as a social learning process. This is one particular story that I really love. There's another story which is actually quite close to you, which is Max Boiseau wrote a really interesting book about how the scientists that discovered the Higgs boson at the S.E.R.D in Geneva, how they work together. And it's exactly the same story. This is the most expensive scientific experiment ever undertaken by, by humans. And it all goes back to a memorandum of understanding of merely 7 pages. From that nucleus, which is not a plan, but maybe a statement of intention and some idea of where these people wanted to go to, they mastered this complexity in a kind of a step-by-step way as a social learning process. And the book by Boiseau really documents this in a most persuasive way. And it's almost a one-on-one mirroring of what you can read in Turnbull's book about how Chartres Cathedral emerged. And the word here that I put forward is a particular conception of change, which Tim Ingold labels as morphogenesis. It's not a Newtonian conception of change where you have a force or that has a certain impact, but it's actually more understood as a confluence of forces and materials, of which human ingenuity is one. So my next exhibit brings it really back to the personal. This is a snapshot from my family album. I'm the second from the left. Must have been about 6 or 7 years old. And this is a picture that has been taken in a street where my grandmother lived. Why am I showing this picture? Because I think this disposition this sensitivity or receptivity to systems ideas is something that we all have. And it's, I think I picked the notion of systemic sensibilities up from Ray Eisen again. And it is those kinds of formative experiences which make us indeed receptive to a systems perspective. Unfortunately, in our education, and in our process of socialization, we are actually, weaned away from those early intuitions about how to deal, with the complexity. This picture, what you can't see here is that this was a dead-end street. It was a cul-de-sac. It ran against a railway line. And I was really fortunate to spend time there at a moment when there were many kids of my age. And so I've experienced this setting as, in a way, as a womb. It was a very protected area. But at the same time, it was also exciting because sometimes it was very dull, but also, sometimes it was full of kids and there was, emerged some kind of celebratory play that was really marvelous in a way. And so this experience of being in a place which is on the one hand protected, on the other hand provides a kind of a platform or a stage for self-organization, and also a platform for exploration of the world beyond that womb, is something that always, I think, is very formative in my particular, let's say, receptivity to systems ideas. And I think that I've always tried to recreate those kinds of environments for myself as a basis for, a kind of a space in which I could both satisfy my curiosity, deal with complexity, but in a way that allowed me to negotiate it with, a reasonable measure of risk. And so for me, this, you could see this in an evolutionary perspective, from growing from young age to, let's say, an adult existence, where you develop your systemic sensibilities, which is the basis for developing systems literacy, which is, getting to know systems concepts, knowing how to use systems tools, which is not unimportant, but using that then as a stepping stone to a systemic practice, which is the systems tinkering. It's the performative element, which then feeds back into your systemic sensibilities. And that's, for me, is kind of a process that as systems practitioners we may work ourselves through. So the questions are, how imaginative are you as an architect in framing and sensing? Yes, it's not only the mind, also a body. Your relationship with the world around you. How high is your tolerance for the inevitable messiness of the process of social learning? How much empathy do you muster in these interactions? These are, I think, important questions for systems practitioners. So I'm talking about imagination, again, I'm talking about acceptance, I'm talking about empathy. And this clearly shows that systems thinking and practice, from my point of view, involves the whole person. I'm always still 2 exhibits to go. I hope you can be a little bit patient with me as I move towards the end of my talk, because here I'm actually approaching the urban as a setting, to, so to speak, deploy this kind of systems thinking in practice. This is a plan. You may recognize it. It's the Grande Pianta from the design for Il Campo Marzio in antique Rome that Piranesi left us, which has been a really puzzling plan, and there's many theories about what it actually means. Manfred Tafuri, Lars Spurbrook, Stan Allen, they all have been, being mesmerized and intrigued by this. And I think it's a nice metaphor again, and allows me to make the point that it's not so important, or the key point is not whether there is a plan, but the thing is, how does it come to life and how is it being put to use? So the question is, what kind of readings of the city does this plan embody? And to what extent is it able to sustain these richly generative conversations that we need in order to nourish our capacity for change? That is basically what I think is a major question for any urban planner or landscape architect or person with that kind of, you know, disciplinary perspective and ambition. So what readings of the city are able to do that? Is it the city as a wicked problem? Is it a smart city? Is it a circular city, a just city, the city as a palimpsest, an isotropic city? You know, there's many potential readings we might put forward. I'm not going to pass judgment on any of those, but I think we should try to evaluate them on that merit. How do they support these conversations? The conversations that really, you know, so to speak, embody our intelligence, our collective intelligence, when we move forward through that complexity in a step-by-step way, as, you know, the Cathedral of Chartres was built, as Sears, you know, developed his business empire. I think this all follows almost the same kind of algorithm, to almost an algorithm that is designed to absorb complexity in an ongoing way. And so it's not about the plan, it's almost about the meta plan. It is about the conditions that allow us to continuously redesign our plans in order to, in the light of new information, in the light of the changes that are actually befalling our cities. So the question is, if transition is a symphony of conversations, which I think it is, and interventions of all kinds, then a systems practice sustains the conditions for that symphony to sound and to unfold. And so that raises, I think, a lot of interesting questions, for architects and planners. I'm going to, as a final exhibit, going to bring it a little back to something which may be closer to your life world, and also, you know, offers one way, I think, of embodying these ideas into a kind of a coherent practice of urban planning and design. And this is the work of Janice Birkeland, who is an American, let's say, legal activist, almost an urban planner, who spent most of her career actually in Australia and New Zealand. And she's written a number of interesting books, notably Positive Development, from vicious cycles to virtuous, from vicious circles to virtuous cycles in the built environment is one of her books. Her latest one was Net Positive Design and Sustainable Urban Development, which was published in 2 years ago, or last year even. And so what is interesting about her work, I think what she does in her work is to provide a kind of a coherent and richly layered frame setting to deploy systems thinking in practice with a bearing on urban transformation and transition processes. And this, I would just like to reveal 5 key elements in her thinking. One is that she makes a very explicit boundary judgment. She says we should not look only at the city, but we should look at the city as it is embedded in its bioregion or its hinterland. I think that's one key element. The second one is that she uses a particular lens to look at urban realities, which is a metabolic lens. So it's about resource transfers. And she develops a fairly sophisticated, I would say, apparatus to map, understand how these resource transfers are manifesting themselves in that environment. The third point is that she has an explicit ambition to move away from the received way of doing, let's say, the trade-offs which are embedded in a standard or a traditional planning practice. So that the idea is really to transcend those trade-offs and also to transcend the limitations of what markets and what regulation can offer. And she allots a very crucial role to design as a factor, a factor, a discipline, that is able to contribute to that. And then very importantly also, design is very crucial, but also what she calls her constitutional approach, meaning that with its constitutional approach is the design of an arena, a discursive arena where people can really meet and exchange ideas, It's designed to create transparency and make norms, so normative choices and worldviews explicit. Also to agree on a number of shared ethical principles, which should be at the basis of that conversation. And then to debate the purpose and the scope of the interventions in that urban setting, so to speak. And also to accommodate, residual differences between the actors that are involved, because there's always, at the crossroads of divergent interests, these planning processes, as you will very well be aware of. So I think what Berkland proposes is a really interesting set of ideas, and actually almost she creates a scene in which these conversations can happen, and design has a role to play there, and also all kinds of systemic principles and ideas about resource transfers. So this is something that I really recommend as a way of, one potential way of transposing systemic ideas or systems thinking in practice within the setting of urban transition. Finally, and this ought to be exhibit 9, not 8, I would like to conclude with simply two quotes which in a way summarize or capture certain crucial ideas, central ideas I wanted to propose to you. One is a quote by Marc Auger, a sociologist whom you're probably familiar. He says, "Perhaps we are in the process of learning to change the world before imagining it, converting to a sort of political and practical existentialism. We now need to turn towards the future without projecting our illusions on it, to learn to push back gradually and prudently the frontiers of the unknown." So I hope that you see how that resonates with what I said earlier. And then the second quote is by Gilles Deleuze, the philosopher. "It is no longer a question of imposing a form upon a matter, but of elaborating an increasingly rich and consistent material. The better to tap increasingly intense forces. What makes a material increasingly rich is the same as what holds heterogeneities together without ceasing to be heterogeneous." That's my final word in this talk. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Can you hear me? Or
Yes.
It's okay. We do not know. Okay. Like, I really ask if there are questions from the audience or commentaries.
First here in the foyer.
Yeah.
Maybe Anna Carla, is there any question on Zoom?
For the moment, no.
Okay.
But we are waiting if you want to have some questions, and we can write down here on the chat. And
Do
we
not hesitate to write
discussion.
on the chat yet.
Exactly.
Also, if you're totally confused, please let me know.
Yeah, let's start.
I can just react. Thank you, Philippe. I must say that, so, I'm an architect. We are mainly architect, and particularly architect involved in more urban scales. And I must say that when I studied, I was thought that urbanism, or the field of urban design, but urban planning also, is not a disciplinary strong field, in the sense that it is sort of the outcome of practices of bricolage, obviously of amateur, and so in a way, the way also you sketch this universe of system thinking, or the side of this universe that you find more
fruitful and more relevant. In a sense, it's a bit, it's so close to the way in which I was educated that in a way it seems to be too simple. How can be so close, and how am I a sort of a system thinker I didn't know before? And yeah, this is the first reaction, and maybe you can let us say what you think about this reaction. My other question is about a particular competence, which is the visualizing concept, the drawing, putting an image, represented through images, through visuals, which is really characterizing our own competencies. What about that? Is there a particular, it in a sense, I think any language has some, can I say, pour et contre, or what is in English? Pro and cons. Pro and cons. Every language has pro and cons. So I think that the ability of visualizing can be a pro and then can be also a cons. We saw together the way in which Christopher Alexander say that the way in which we visualize, and particularly the Gestalt approach, is in a sense making a sort of obstacle of our capacity of grasping a systemic dimension, or a more complex, not yet systemic, but a more complex dimension, because the Gestalt, in a sense, simplify a bit, oblige us to simplify what we see or what we can conceptualize. So just some words more from you, more referred to our being architects. So
yes,
yeah, I'll let you answer.
Elena, if my talk was able to reinforce your self-confidence as a systems thinker, then I'm really very happy. Then, you know, that is what I definitely could hope for. But I think you're absolutely right. I think as architects, you are, particularly well predisposed, I would say, to engage in this field. So you shouldn't be at all intimidated by it. You should really appropriate it as your own. Today there's a lot of talk also about design thinking versus systems thinking. For me, they are branches of the same tree. They're actually grafted onto the same trunk. I see they have a common lineage, and it's unfortunate that they're put into separate boxes. So I would definitely, let's say, confirm or endorse, so to speak, your assessment that as architects you're particularly well disposed to engage in this field. The matter of drawing is it's something that I'm a little bit, I'm not a drawer personally, but I'm very willing to acknowledge the kind of transformative potential that is in drawing. But there is also a risk I see. I think that sometimes it tends to turn into a fetish, almost, the drawing, that it becomes hermetic in its sophistication. And so, that's one thing that I would like to underline. And the other thing is the distinction almost between the performative activity of drawing, putting the lines on paper, versus the end result, which is a drawing. And I think there's a different significance that is associated to each. I think the activity of drawing, I think, is as a kind of a heuristic process of shaping ideas, either individually or collectively, is very valuable. And as a matter of fact, I think it was even today that I saw this in a snippet online. That happens to be the case that Norman Foster's sketchbooks have just been published in a quite luxurious edition. And there was a little discussion on that online, in which one of the guest speakers on that occasion said that indeed, in contemporary architectural studio, there is very little drawing because everything happens by computer. And he expressed a regret about that. And I can sympathize with that. I think something is lost by moving, to digital tools to do that. And the same applies actually to handwriting. Tim Ingold again has written quite eloquently recently in his book Correspondences about his, let's say, regrets about handwriting disappearing from our creative arsenal. Yeah, so that's what I would like to offer as initial thoughts on drawing. But I think it's a matter that merits a lot of more reflection and discussion, no doubt. A question from the students.
Yeah.
They're probably also tired because they had a huge day of midterm review.
Indeed. With the midterm review. Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's probably why they're not so reactive, not because they're lost. I think your lecture was really clear, but if you have any comments or... Okay, if I may, I will just continue. Yes, you can see me here. Yeah, in the same sense that Elena told, I think I have the impression that the rise of systemic thinking seems to overlight a gap between a quite modern specialist way of thinking, but thinking the city and also to plan it. So I'm wondering the success of system thinking is probably linked to this old style way of thinking, but in the same time, I can recognize, or can we recognize, a systemic way of thinking in the modernist movement, for example, or at least in the mainly previous century, And I'm wondering if the architectural culture, in a way, I think it's not so far now from the systemic thinking. You talk about it, and in the past probably we resolved a sort of gap, a possible gap or mismatch between the systems thinking and the selective gaze, or the capacity of synthesis, which is accepted from the architect, and probably which is strongly part of the architectural project, and maybe even more in the territorial projects, the capacity of select information also, so I'm wondering if it's still relevant, this specific and I could say precious capacity of architecture and architects to select, because regarding the Deleuze quality, not imposing a form, but it's quite our destiny, as an architect, not to impose, but people accept us to do choices. So it's not imposing, but at least at the end we should select something and impose it. I think it's part of our destiny. So to simplify, as a simplicity, in a way, it's part of our job, and I'm just wondering if how can we do it better, probably from the past century. But yeah, it was quite. I don't know if it's a question, but probably it raised some comments from your part.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's inevitable, that we, shape and select, simplify. There is no other way. We can't absorb, the totality. So that process is, in a way, of that reflex is in a way quite understandable, and it's inevitable. The question is, rather that, how reflexive are we about what we, select, and how open is that, so to speak? We are entering maybe, the territory of, participatory design, or, but I think that ought to be, it's about transparency, about how these choices have been made, and how inclusive, so to speak, how generative that process of selecting and bringing into focus actually is. So that's also why I said the key is not whether there is a plan. Of course, we need plans, which selectively bring things in focus, but it's rather than how does that come into being? Is it the white, what is it, the architect as it, the archetypal modernist architect with the white thing, the white dress, so to speak, almost,
Blues,
as
yes.
the expert, or is it, or it has the architect another position? And then once the plan is there, how is it used? What kind of conversations are actually opened up, enabled by it? So I think the responsibility of the architect goes much further than simply to bring into focus and into a plan. It's also to be accountable for how the plan emerges. And then also for the kinds of conversations that actually are emerging from that plan, and be willing at any point in time to reframe, reconceptualize, and refocus as and when the conversation requires it. That's what what we do. I have, as another type of professional and other types of coming from another discipline, partly. We use these kinds of what we call soft systems methodologies in order to exactly that. Selectively focus, submit to the scrutiny of all our stakeholders, and continuously weave from the artifact, to the relevant questions that are triggered by that artifact back to a kind of a reframed and reconceptualized artifact. It's always cycling through that. And I think a plan is a very powerful way of doing that. But again, it's like the drawing. It can create its own reality and assume a level of authoritativeness, which is forbidding. And then it doesn't help anymore.
My question was really linked to the a crisis, a kind of crisis from the architectural, the legitimacy of the architect as an expertise now. And I'm wondering if the systemic thinking is giving more arguments to reinforce this critique look on the past century, but also on the architectural culture and as a legacy. And I'm just wondering is it the expertise problem, or it is more than the systemic approach on the past century was most focused on specific systems, on culture, on human ones, more than ecological ones. So I'm just wondering is it a crisis, or the expertise crisis of architects, or just a partial way of thinking the complexity? And I'm just wondering if the ecological approach should be the how the ecological arguments can be more relevant, not just to reinforce the critique of the expertise, but asking this expertise taking into account more this other side of the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the way you answer the question actually answers the question also, in a way. Yes, it's a matter of reframing. It's a matter of boundary judgment, but then about what is the remit of a particular kind of profession. Mm-hmm. And so moving from the built environment, exactly as Birkeland does, moving from the built environment to the context, taking into account the context in which that built environment is actually providing, so to speak, its services and fulfills its functions, is an important change in perspective. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's actually a bit in the same idea of this social learning that you were talking about, and maybe just to go a bit deeper in this notion of boundary, because if you're defining a system with a boundary, basically that also means that you're excluding a part of it. And hence, even because you were also talking about inclusivity and openness of the system as a way to basically
develop or fuel this social learning processes. But then by defining a boundary, you're obviously also creating exclusion in a sense. So basically, how do we go like bridge this paradigm of always excluding something, or are we just bound to always exclude something in the process of thinking with a boundary, basically?
That's a good question, and it's actually at the very basis of what is called the critical systems thinking line in this whole field. Critical in the sense that it wants to account for the way it makes those boundary judgments. And so one way of dealing with that is first to be transparent about those boundary judgments. And so to name them and to articulate from which perspective and which position are we making this judgment now. Second is actually to underline, not only underline, but to really reinforce the provisional status of the boundary judgment, which is the constant invitation then to review them. The thing is that a plan will articulate certain boundary judgments, but Peter Checkland made a really interesting distinction about how we should use models, which is always bring particular things into focus and exclude other things, or plans which do the same thing. The thing is that if you look at it from, let's say, a hard systems perspective, you would say, the plan is a reflection of reality, or my model is a reflection of reality. The other way of looking at it, which is more the constructivist way of looking at it, is saying that, this plan or this model is simply a device that allows me to engage systemically, i.e. in a social learning kind of way, with that confusion and that complexity. So we're developing plans and models not of the world, but to intervene, to facilitate interventions in the world, which is a crucial distinction. And then once we articulate the role of plans and models in that way, they become much more amenable to revision and reframing. You see, because then it's totally contingent on the situation, on the participants, on whoever is affected by this whole process of transition, how we are going to articulate, our models and what is going to be included in our plans. You see?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just continuing on that point, does it, even if the plan becomes a built project, if it's about how if it's about its perception, how it's perceived, how it's developed, and where the boundaries are, does it, even if built, does it always remain a plan? I mean, because as soon as it becomes built, then you boundaries become, they're no longer drawn, they exist, and everyone then who has participated or not participated is then part of the system, and therefore it yes. remains a plan. It's automatically just the next plan.
Yes, it's a there you have a temporary solidification of boundaries, and of course, I mean, that creates its own reality, not only because it is built of solid materials, but also because it is enmeshed in a particular, let's say, economic and social reality. That also determines the solidity of that artifact. If conditions change, if the thing is going to weather and is going to erode or, become subject to what's the right word? When it's going to be affected by wear, then, maybe an opportunity arises to reconsider, its boundaries. And I think we are even at liberty, even if we have a physical artifact, to reconsider it and reframe it in relationship to its environment. So, but I think it's not so much the solidity, the material manifestation of the artifact, than rather, the social and economic imperatives in which it is enmeshed that provides it with that solidity. Yes, to think of a good example, and probably also it's not only, it's also a matter of, I would say, architectural paradigm almost. What, I don't know whether you've read the book by François Chauvet, The Rule and the Model. Have you ever read that? I find that interesting because it contrasts two paradigms almost of conceptions of architecture. One which was associated particularly with, I think it was Alberti, the Renaissance architect, which in a way embodies an old ideal of what was it, Vitruvius? Yes, and then Alberti. It embodies an old ideal of architecture, which is actually to almost mirror natural models, so to speak, in human artifacts, versus a more rule-oriented practice and conception of architecture, which is much more focused on functionality. So on the one hand, the architect embodies a discipline that manifests, I would say, natural laws almost in human-built artifacts. On the other hand, the architect becomes a spatial problem solver. And I think artifacts that have been conceptualized from both these vantage points show, it's a hypothesis. I don't know whether that is true, but I think they show a different potential for reframing and reappropriation when it's functionally defined versus when it is, I would say, I'm really struggling to find the right word there. Functionally defined versus, I think it's more a matter of conceiving it in terms of generative models we find back in nature, which are, have some kind of universal appeal, I would almost say. Then my hypothesis would be that is actually, in a way, a decisive factor also in how such an artifact lends itself to reframing and recontextualization. But that's speculative.
Yeah, another question here.
Hello.
Hi.
I don't have a question per se, but thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting and extremely complex. But I think that's why there's not so many questions around here. But no, I wanted to tap in. It was really interesting what you said. It's not about finding truth.
No.
It's not about finding this absolute finite static thing, but rather finding viable solutions, or rather having to find like this relative kind of solutions. And I found that extremely interesting from multiple point of views, but I think it's also interesting in the domain of architecture, because as you said, it's oftentimes that we kind of come with one grand idea and want to impose it directly and just as it is in the plan, it's built like that, and it's very easy to it's mostly easy to work with dogmas and in ideologies rather than adapt them to the very complex nature on the ground of society in general. Mm-hmm. So I think it's also really interesting of what you said, that the model or the plan is a reflection of the world, but it shouldn't be the end, but it's a means to an end. It's just a tool, and that was also interesting to go to Luis Barragan, the Mexican architect, who used to draw his plans, but then on the construction side, he would completely change everything. And whereas it was, I think it was a complete nightmare for the planners, for the builders, and we can, like, especially in Switzerland, we cannot imagine something like that. But I think it's that imagination and that adaptability to that openness to change, of like when you are already in there. Like it's completely something different when you see a plan or a model in a small scale versus going there one-to-one and experiences the space and thinking, okay, this could be different, this could be changed. But so finding the best solution, but also on the spot, and being able to have this openness to adapt. Yes, thank you very much. It was super interesting.
Well, I'm happy that despite the complexity, you have really grasped one of the key elements that I wanted to share with you. That's and this lovely example you're giving there. Would love to hear more about that Mexican architect. But yes, no, the point you're making is pertinent and very much what I wanted to share. Yes.
Philippe, I'm gonna make also a point, like a conversation regarding some things that you said. At a certain point, you were worried that this complexity might be intimidating. And I take back this word because I think that it jumps to another important aspect, which is that, yes, we say systems are everywhere and somehow we are systems thinker, but perhaps we don't know it yet. However, you mentioned certain words that are not so common in our everyday life, which are empathy, sensitivity, worldviews, acting as humans. And this, especially in our work as architects and urban planners, sometimes we separate the two, especially because getting very much engaged in our work with what we design, being human in what we design, empathize with the people who are going to live there, requires a lot of inner strength and also to know ourselves very well. And if we start then looking at systems and empathize with them, we enter complexity and we start looking at all what is going on in terms of our impact on the planet and how our artifacts have tremendous impacts in terms of CO2 emissions, energy consumption. So we realize that our actions can actually be very strongly detrimental. And this, I jump back into intimidated. So I wonder, to what extent could we find comfort in systems? I know it is a difficult question, but is there a way in which today the students can leave this room and think, okay, systems can somehow, navigating systems can provide us a certain feeling of comfort, of going back to human, of being able to design with this knowledge instead of being intimidated by that?
Lovely question. I would say that it would maybe invite us to assume a position or a disposition of comfortable discomfort, rather than outright comfort, because comfortable it will never be. Taking up that, yielding to that invitation of, I would say, imagination and empathy is always going to confront us with unknowns. We're always going to risk to lose face vis-a-vis our peers. We will have to position ourselves or show ourselves to an extent as somewhat vulnerable, and that's hard. That's hard. So there's discomfort. And I think it's unavoidable. And but on the other hand, I think once you yield to that kind of sentiment, I think there's also some kind of inevitability. An inevitability in the sense that, there's a feeling that doing this, living the profession in this way is the right thing to do. And that, I think, is a source of comfort. And I think those are keeping it, keeping one another in a kind of a precarious balance. And I see that in my work, you know, how sometimes we tilt back into the relative illusory safety of, you know, protocols, rules, standards, whatever it is. But it's beautiful when, you know, it's really beautiful and it really in an aesthetic sense, when we're able to maintain ourselves in that other way of operating, which is more genuinely seeking, genuinely search or research by design as search. Then I think, you know, these are, it's a matter of trying, maybe failing and trying again. And in that respect, I think eventually, you know, for me, who are the most, let's say, inspiring examples of systems thinking in practice, in many cases, are artists. I think an artistic practice, in essence, does that, is a constant opening to coming to terms with temporary consolidation of uncertainty, insecurity, and manifesting that in physical artifacts or whatever it is, different media. And I think there's a lot of, you know, that for me, that's where I draw a lot of inspiration from. And I try to live my own practice from a kind of an artistic ethos.
I think it's a nice conclusion, no, to finish with that. Thank you very much, Philippe. Maybe Elena, you want to address a final word? Or?
Oh, no, thank you also on behalf of myself, of Anna, and of students. You must know that students have done, I think, a very big effort. I can really see in your own faces the symptoms of a big effort. So just also thank you for being there and attending the conference, the lecture. We'll hope to have opportunity to meet future. Let's see, for sure. Yes, and thank you very much. Thank you for your inspiring lecture.
Thanks for the invitation. I wish you really, all of you, a restful evening after all the effort for your midterm review.
Thank you. And tomorrow there is no